I was driving back from North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, listening to the news. The Kavanaugh confirmation was coming down to the wire. And it made me remember that when I was in high school, I dated a guy named Richard Hertz. I know what you're thinking. Madeline dated Dick Hertz. I don't know how parents could do that to a kid, but they did. And even though he had a questionable reputation, I still accepted a date from him because he had the coolest car. It was a 1955 Singer. It was a little British sports car. It was just the coolest little thing ever. Well, it was a balmy spring Saturday night. Dickie came to my house to pick me up, and he told my parents he was taking me to a concert, which to my mother meant, "Oh, Madeline's going to Carnegie Hall, how lovely." In fact, where we went was to an underground, smoke-filled jazz club in Harlem. They didn't card us at the door, so I got a frozen daiquiri, and Dickie got one after another shots of scotch, which he was throwing back and following up with water. And by the time we left, he was pretty drunk. We got into his car. We drove around a little bit, trying to find the highway, and somehow stopped at a dead-end street flanked by abandoned warehouses without another person or another car or anything in sight other than those empty buildings. And then, with the ignition still running, he leaned forward, rested his head on the steering wheel, and passed out cold. I tried to wake him up, and I couldn't. And this was back in the days when there were no such things as cell phones. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I couldn't very well go walking around those streets in the middle of the night looking for a payphone. So I just sat there hoping that maybe another car would come along and its occupant wouldn't be an axe murderer. And after an hour, a car pulled up. A man got out. He was a policeman. He walked over and shone his flashlight on us. "Well, what seems to be the trouble here?" I pointed to my passed out date. "He's drunk," I said. Back then, drunk driving wasn't the big deal it is now. The cop went back to his car and got a thermos of hot coffee. He brought it over and shook Dickie into alertness and then poured the coffee down him until Dickie said, I'm up, I can drive, I can do this." And the cop said, "Okay," and got back into his car and drove off. So we drove away, we zigzagged through a couple of streets, and we eventually found our way back to the highway and swerved our way back to my home. By the time we got there, he was a little bit more coherent. And of course, I was way past my curfew. My parents were waiting up. I could see them in the living room windows. As soon as we pulled up, they ran outside. My mother came over to me, "Are you okay?" And without a moment's hesitation, Dickie Hertz said, "Oh, Mrs. Copperman, Madeline is fine. I'm so sorry you were worried about her. I never wanted to worry you, but we were coming home on the Belt Parkway, and I got a flat. And then when I tried to change it, my spare had a flat, and it took hours until someone came along who could help us." My father, who was no one's fool, took one look at him and said, "Son, would you like to lie down for a while, or do you need a cup of black coffee?" And Dickie said, "No, sir," and drove off. Back in the house, my mother looked intently at me, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I knew what she was hinting at. And I said, Mom, I'm fine. My father didn't say anything for a while. He just shook his head back and forth, back and forth. And finally, he looked at me and said, "Are you smarter now?" And I said, "Yes, Daddy, I am." And he said, "Good. Then you can go to bed." And we never talked about it again. Some lessons are learned through conversation and observation. Others are learned through experience. I learned not to judge a man by his car. And we all lived happily ever after. Thank you.